Russia's Navy has conducted military drills in the Arctic. The training, which used live ammunition, took place in the Laptev Sea. The Russian fleet staged exercises focused on protecting Russian-held islands in the region. The Kremlin has recently become more strident in its actions in the Arctic. The Russian Air Force has flown fighter jets close to American and Canadian airspace in the region, while Moscow also recently reopened a military base stationed in the Arctic. The polar region is thought to contain over 20% of the world's future energy reserves. Major Russian drilling in the region recently led to the discovery of billions of barrels of oil.
In tonight's Green Report, the oil barons of the world and the militaries that rely on that oil are seeing new opportunities in the North Pole as global climate change kicks into high gear. Warming weather is leading to the northern ice cap melting, uncovering a treasure trove of oil and natural gas reserves. Scientists believe that the Arctic is storing 13% of the world's untapped oil and nearly a third of the world's undiscovered natural gas. As the ice melts, access to these resources becomes easier and shipping lanes open. So now northern nations are scrambling to stake out their chunk of Arctic resources, as well as running military operations in the area should they have to fight for these resources in the not-too-distant future. In fact, 2 months ago, military leaders from the United States, Canada, Russia, Iceland, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Finland met to discuss security issues around the Arctic.
As the Arctic sea ice melts away at an alarming rate, access to vast oil reserves is opening up, and countries bordering the region are determined to defend their slice of the pie. The polar seabed may hold as much as 15% of the world's undiscovered oil and 30% of its natural gas. But as RT's Marina Portnaya found out, the battle for the region could take a dangerous turn.
Melting ice caps in the Arctic have ignited a military buildup over the world's smallest ocean and the raw riches buried beneath it. The Arctic Circle is believed to contain 30% of the world's undiscovered natural gas and 15% of its oil.
The future of the world economy to some extent is dependent on the Arctic, and I think, Russia and Canada, the United States and Norway and Denmark are very interested in exploiting these resources.
Last month, Canada abruptly claimed that it owned the North Pole, while the United States, with its Alaskan outpost, has plans to boost its military there, claiming it lacks operational experience and needs to police the thinning ice as it's replaced by fuel-filled maritime traffic. But that's not all.
Actually, U.S. submarines are deployed not too far away, off the Norwegian coast. It would take U.S. missiles 16 to 17 minutes to get from there to Moscow. So we really hope that with all the things that have been happening in the world over the past few decades, we have put the Cold War confrontation behind us.
In all, 5 countries bordering the Arctic have sovereign rights to resources within 200 nautical miles of their territorial waterways. But a growing appetite for a bigger slice of the pie is what many fear can inevitably spark a 21st century Cold War in the frozen waters.
There are also unexplored resources that we don't know yet to which country belongs, which could be, of course, of interest to many countries. I do think that smaller things could spark both tension and maybe more tension than we would like to see.
Marina Portnaya, RT, New York.
We heard earlier from Christopher Perry, a strategic forecaster and former British naval officer. He thinks clashes are inevitable in the race for the Arctic.
Where I think we could have some disputes is there are a number of other interested countries such as India, China, Korea, Japan, all getting very interested not just in the Northern Sea route but also in the resources that exist up there and in the Arctic. Already the Chinese are operating in Greenland and places like that, and I think there will be a scramble by some of the other countries for some of those resources. When the ice does recede, you're not just going to have the Northern Sea route across the top of Russia and the Northwest Passage across Canada, you're also going to have a route around straight across the top of the North Pole. Now that means that the countries that in the past have faced each other across the North Pole, that icy waste, are going to have open water for quite a few months of the year, and that will introduce different perspectives, different geometries. You're going to see Canada and the United States also entering into the Arctic. So it's going to be an interesting situation from a strategic point of view.
Well, for more on Putin's re-emergence and the Russian military Arctic drills, we're joined by Anton Fedyashin. He's a professor at American University and the executive director of the Initiative for Russian Culture. Anton, thanks for being on the program.
Thank you for having me.
So let's get to the Russian military exercises. Sure. We're talking about some 40,000 troops, 41 ships, 15 submarines, 110 aircraft.
Right.
Does this seem like a routine drill to you?
Well, there's nothing routine about Russia's Arctic coastline, which is the longest in the world. And since Norway just launched exercises with 5,000 men, and this is a country of 5 million people, then if you were to expect the Russians to do something proportional to what the Norwegians are doing, they should have been using 150,000 men, one for each million, but they're not. So as a matter of fact, if you take it per capita, Russia's training exercise is significantly smaller than Norway's. But when you consider the size of the country, its population, and the length of its coastline, this is actually a fairly small exercise given the amount of territory that they have to defend.
So why is it getting so much attention?
Because Russia's getting a lot of attention, and there are war parties in Europe and in the U.S. who are waiting for news like this in order to justify growing budgets or budget or requirements and asks.
Do you think there is a message in these exercises from Vladimir Putin, and what do you make of the timing? Of course, the conflict in Ukraine is going on, and then he vanishes for 10 days.
Sure. I don't think there's any connection between the vanishing and the exercises in the north and all over Russia. But look, all countries conduct military exercises on a regular basis. Russia conducts about 3,500 a year. They're getting a lot more attention these days. I think the message of this one in particular is that Russia is still a player all over the Eurasian region, including in the Arctic.
And do you anticipate more of these types of intense military exercises, especially because of what's going on in Ukraine and the rising tensions between Moscow and Washington and the West?
I think we're seeing a lot of tit for tat, a lot of posturing on both sides. And so every time NATO does something, the Russians do something which is even bigger and wider in scale, which of course they can afford to do. Their army is bigger than any of the single NATO armies. So when NATO moves into the Black Sea, the Russians move into the Black Sea. And so as long as this posturing continues, we'll see this back and forth. The most important thing is for it not to become confrontational. But
Russia won't create an Arctic military force irrespective of any territorial disputes that may develop in the energy-rich region. Now that's according to the country's envoy to the 8-nation Arctic Council. Anton Vasilyev said that Russia does plan to strengthen security there, but the primary goal is to ensure safe navigation. The statement follows last week's breakthrough maritime border deal with Norway. Canada, meanwhile, said it's ready to challenge Russia in the race for the region's resources. Scientists are also working to provide arguments about the length of the Arctic shelf for an international forum in Moscow. The event will be held on Wednesday and Thursday and focus on balancing interests in the region.
A remote and forbidding Arctic island, home only to a weather station and the odd polar bear, is about to become a bustling military base. That's because Russia is boosting its naval presence in the region. RT's Murad Gazdiev was among the first new arrivals.
The island of Kotelny looks like a barren wasteland, and that's because it is. Alien may be the best word to describe a landscape that looks eerily like you'd imagine the surface of Mars. There's not a tree nor a shrub in sight.
One of the major features of the island of Kotelny is its sheer hostility to life. Much of the island is made up of this, rocks and pebbles, and just a few meters below us is permafrost, as it never gets warm enough here to properly thaw out.
But that hasn't stopped man. While the island was abandoned by the Soviet military decades ago, a remote meteorological station stayed on. The station team was overjoyed to host the Rear Admiral. There aren't many visitors up here. A pack of dogs greeted us at the helicopter pad, the first and best line of defense against curious polar bears, affectionately called Mishkas, who wander in from time to time.
The polar bears here only pretend to be scared of the dogs.
But they do leave?
Eventually. They aren't scared of one dog, but the pack surrounds them, confuses them, and eventually they run away back into the tundra.
After lunch, Igor showed us one of the island's treasures, a mammoth's tusk. Apparently there's been a real problem with mainlanders coming in and setting up illegal dig sites. He was also happy that the Russian military was back. Company at last.
This is the new home of the 99th Arctic Tactical Group, which will be stationed here on the island of Kotelny permanently. Now, their accommodations for now, they may look humble, and they are, but big things are expected on this island. Just to our right, a new runway is being paved, while a few kilometers to the north, an entire city is being brought up to house the military.
An army of construction workers and equipment have been brought into the island, and they've got their work cut out for them. There are no roads, no infrastructures to speak of. It really is one rough ride.
This is normal for Arctic latitudes. The conditions are of course harsh, but we're coping. We've got the food, the equipment, so we'll survive just fine.
Moscow's sparing no expense on its Arctic projects, much like Canada, America and other nations contending for the North Pole. But while Russia's icebreaker fleet and experience in the Arctic give it an edge, nothing's being left to chance. Morad Gazdiev, RT, Kotelny Island.
The Danish government has announced plans to claim a section of the disputed Arctic territory, including the North Pole. The Kingdom of Denmark's claim centres around the continental shelf of Greenland, an autonomous Danish island. Russia, Canada, Norway and the United States, through Alaska, also claim parts of the polar territory. Copenhagen's submission significantly overlaps with the proposals made by Moscow and Ottawa. Russia has been strident in recent months over their Arctic ambitions by undertaking military training exercises and drawing up plans for extensive oil drilling. All 5 countries have already agreed that a UN panel will decide sovereignty of the Arctic under existing rules of the sea. The US Geological Survey estimates the Arctic is home to over 20% of the world's future energy reserves.
The North Pole is over 5 million square miles in size and could potentially contain more than 13% of the world's oil reserves. Due to melting ice caps, it is also a region that's becoming more and more accessible. So who owns the North Pole, and who has the rights to those natural resources? Well, as it stands now, no one owns or holds political sovereignty over the North Pole. But Russia, Canada, the US, Denmark, and Norway have laid claim to part, if not all of it. Russia even went so far as to send a diving team in 2007 to plant a Russian flag on the seafloor underneath the pole. And there are reports that they've beefed up their military presence in the northernmost parts of the country to further establish that claim. So is that it? Does the country with the most flags and lonely soldiers in long johns get to claim the North Pole for themselves? No. That may work with uninhabited and unclaimed land, but the North Pole isn't even land. It's just ice floating in international waters. And there's a governing body that makes decisions about international waters, the United Nations. Their Law of the Sea Convention, which was ratified in 1994, establishes guidelines for who owns which parts of the ocean. To put it into basic terms, each nation owns the natural resources of any water or land under that water, so long as it's within 200 nautical miles of their shores, or up to 300 nautical miles of their continental shelf. This is called their exclusive economic zone. The problem with the North Pole is that it's covered in ice, and we don't know exactly what the continental shelf underneath it looks like, or what melting ice may uncover. There are already a few specks of land in the area whose ownership is under dispute. We also don't know which sections of the North Pole will become trade routes. Trade routes are largely treated as international waters and allow for free and unencumbered passage by all nations. So Canada, for example, may have difficulty claiming the Northwest Passage because other nations are already insisting that it is a valuable trade route that can't be blocked. All of these issues and more have to be addressed and reviewed by the UN before a country can establish ownership to the North Pole. And putting together a claim and then getting it approved is an extremely lengthy process. So the North Pole will most likely remain in dispute for some time.
I know that Russia and Norway a few years ago had kind of a deal going about, with the Barents Sea, and they're going to split it in half and everything was okay then. So why now? Why is Putin just pulling a geopolitical temper tantrum or just flexing his muscles literally and figuratively here? Why now, though?
Well, first of all, they heard that the Canadians are putting a claim all the way to the North Pole. The Russians put that claim about 8 years ago. It went to the United Nations Tribunal. under the Law of the Sea Treaty, and the tribunal told the Russians, you did not prepare your homework, you didn't bring enough maps or enough papers, go back and come back later. The Russians did not come back on a deadline, but they have up to 10 years to file that claim. Now, if the United Nations Tribunal considers a Russian claim all the way to the North Pole, the Canadian claim all the way to the North Pole, and there's some overlap, they may decide that this territory belongs to Russia, that territory belongs to Canada, and as much as I'm not a supporter of the United Nations, this is much better than going to war. And talk about a Cold War. That's really, really cold.
Yeah, it's very cold. Sarah, you know,
in the hands of the UN. They should have hired you. The Russians should have hired Buck Sexton for the maps.
That's right. I was going to say, Sarah, lesson number one, never go into the meeting without enough maps. That's for
right.
starters, very important. But also we see here the sort of the rise of a geopolitics that looks further into the future. I'm pretty sure that if you were to take a globe and you see that actually at one point, if the Soviet Union was going to fire ICBMs at the United States, it would have come over, actually, this landmass. It could have come that way as opposed to going all the way across the Atlantic. So there are missile defense issues here down the line.
That's right.
Global warming. I know we don't use that term anymore, but there is some breakage of the ice up there. This is changing the game up there.
Oh, yeah, that's what they're looking at. I mean, I think Vladimir Putin is looking at a long-term goal here in the North Pole, and we definitely can see that even right now, I mean, even with Canada, there's a lot of other players here that are interested in the North Pole. There's, like you said, 30%, they believe, estimated, of the world's undiscovered gas is in the North Pole. 15% undiscovered oil. So once we get the technology, I mean, they're saying the future's here. We can get the technology to access these resources.
Russia has kicked off massive 5-day military drills amid spiraling tensions with the West over the crisis in Ukraine. The exercises are happening in the Arctic Ocean and other areas in the north of the country. Nearly 40,000 servicemen and scores of warships, submarines, helicopters and airplanes are taking part in the maneuvers. Russian officials say the drills are aimed at checking the readiness of Russia's Northern Sea Fleet and preparing the army to confront the challenges and threats the country faces. Moscow is concerned over NATO's military exercises close to its borders. The Western Military Alliance ended all practical cooperation with Russia over the ongoing crisis in Ukraine last April. The Russian President Vladimir Putin has appeared in public for the first time in 10 days, ending rumors about his health and whereabouts. Putin came in front of cameras at a meeting with the Kyrgyz President Almazbek Atambayev on Monday. During the meeting, the Russian president referred to the rumors, saying that he would be bored if there were none. His spokesman also said that Putin and Atambayev had a driving tour outside the venue of their meeting to end speculations about the former's health. He was last seen in public on March 5 and had called off several scheduled events, including a trip to Kazakhstan over the last week. His absence set off rumors that he was sick, had died, or was deposed in a coup.
Russia's Northern Fleet began SNAP exercises in the Murmansk region in the Arctic on Monday. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu is reported to have said that the purpose of the drills is to assess the fleet's performance in the Arctic and to ensure it's ready in case it's faced with new challenges and threats. Around 38,000 military personnel and 3,300 units of military equipment will take part in the maneuver. The drills are set to last until Saturday.
Блять, надо быстро заходить. Головой? Полотенце, быстрее. Нет, Серега, полотенце не надо. Двигаться. Так, что за крикнуть, а? Ой, голова ушла под воду?
Да.
Давай, смотри.
Куда?
Назад! С головой, Серега!